Security scan. Please stand by. Scanning. Do not move. Security scan successful. You now have full access to all files. Welcome to Conspiracies, Inc. With your host, Bryan Datillo. Do you believe?
I am Bryan Datillo. This is Conspiracies, Inc. Thank you for joining us for our very first season. As we kick off our first season, as we tackle the alien conspiracy, the alien cover-up, the alien controversy. And as you know, in the first two episodes, we went through my alien abduction. And in the last episode, we kind of left off with a pre-Roswell kind of review. And as promised, this is our Roswell episode. And if we're going to do Roswell, we got to get Don Schmitt here, who we actually have, the #1 UFO Roswell expert, researcher, editor, writer, investigator. He's got too many titles. I'll let him tell you about it. But Don Schmitt, thanks for joining us. I'm so happy that you're here, and it's a huge honor, man. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure to be with you, Bryan. Thank you for asking.
Oh, yeah. Now, what do you say to people who say, what makes you the expert on Roswell? I know you've written a lot of books, you've done your homework, you've done a lot of research, but real quick, I mean, let's face it, if anything happens, Roswell, you're the guy, right? Are you a caretaker of any goods, of any archives? What can you tell us about your background with Roswell, just really quick?
Of course. Well, of course. And, I started out, Bryan, as a special investigator for the foremost authority on the subject of UFOs, and that being Dr. J. Allen Hynek.
There we go.
And then I became his director of special investigations at the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. And I was a skeptic. And I think the fact that we wanted to go after Roswell, we thought we'd make a single weekend jaunt down to New Mexico and prove that this was nothing more than a weather balloon device, as the government still maintains, or something just as prosaic.
Right.
And over the course now of over 30 years, where we have tracked down and interviewed over 600 witnesses, either directly or indirectly involved.
Wow.
I've led 5 archaeological expeditions to the crash site.
Okay.
Where we have sought out physical remnants, evidence of the very event. So in other words, we return to the scene of the crime. We're not these keyboard investigators who try to solve all the mysteries of the world, from their desk.
Right.
I love hands-on. I love speaking to witnesses face to face, where you can see their mannerism, their voice inflection, how their eye contact, which
Right.
gives you a feel for their genuineness, their testimony, that type of thing. And then we founded, I'm one of the co-founders of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell.
That's amazing.
And so we have an historic preservation of all of that information, all of that material, in the midst of all the exploitation and almost the Graceland, Elvis type of, carnival atmosphere in Roswell.
Right.
In the midst of all this is our museum, where we have a research facility. We have the largest UFO library collection in the world, and the museum itself. So I'm proud of all that. If that makes me, an expert, I think it's mainly because I've walked the walk. It isn't a case of a weekend, trip to Roswell, and I declare myself as, the know everything on the subject.
You're overqualified, to tell you the truth.
Well,
and we're lucky to have you. I can't wait.
Thank you.
Now,
Bryan.
Now, I know I did a little research on you prior to this, and I saw that you collaborated with a guy named John Purdy.
Yes.
John Purdy.
John Purdy, who won the equivalent of the Academy Award in England
Right.
As far as his work with the BBC, I know he's working with his own production company,
Right.
but
My mom does my research for me, and she says, "Wait a minute, I know John Purdy. In fact, your manager Paul Cohen knows John Purdy." So I told Paul before I got on this meeting with you. I said, I was researching Don Schmitt, and he did a lot of collaboration with a guy named John Purdy that my mom says you know. And he goes, "Oh, you just gave me goosebumps." She said, "You just gave me goosebumps." He said, he was just thinking, some voice in his head yesterday told him, "I wonder if John Purdy's alive." And he said, "I haven't seen the guy in over 10 years.
yes,
And so for me to bring up John Purdy,
yeah.
it was just weird. It was just weird. But let's get to the Roswell thing. It's just too much to cover right away. Let's get started with that night in July. Do we know exactly when the date was? Was it July 2nd, July 3rd? What date is the exact initial Roswell date? What happened? Who was there first? Tell me what happened that night in July.
Well, even if I just provide quickly a little background history of New Mexico, whenever I'm lecturing on college campuses, I will always ask, especially with the learned faculty present, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? And it's amazing how many of these college professors, well, of course, Japan. Well, how about New Mexico? How about just 2 hours west of Roswell? So you have Trinity Site, first atomic bomb detonation. To the south, the White Sands Proving Grounds, where they at the time were conducting all the testing of the captured German V-2 rockets. And then in Roswell, you had the Roswell Army Airfield, the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, the 509 Bomb Wing, was headquartered there. Mm-hmm. Best pilots, doctors, nurses, pilots, crew, officers, all stationed with the top security clearance in charge of the atomic bomb. Late evening of July 2nd, and the reason we have confirmed the 2nd was that there was a sighting in Roswell to the west side of town by Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Wilmot, who saw a classic disc in broad daylight moving to the northwest up towards that very region. Mm-hmm. And we're talking Lincoln County, the high desert area of New Mexico. And the ranchers all described that there was a severe thunder lightning storm that night. And they described that between the thunderclaps, they heard what sounded like an explosion. Okay. Well, we confirmed with the Stallion Weather Network that indeed there was such a storm the late evening of July 2nd. So it all came together. Early morning, July 3rd, ranch foreman by the name of W.W. Brazo discovers a huge debris field of the strangest material he had ever seen. Okay. Covered an area of almost 9/10 of a mile long. And there was a young boy with him at the time, 7-year-old Timothy D. Proctor. His nearest neighbors 10 miles away, Floyd and Loretta Proctor, their son, happened to be with Brazo at the time. Okay. So for the next few days, he's alerting his neighbors. Who can recognize, who can identify any of this wreckage? Even a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins suggested you need to report it to the authorities in Roswell. So on Sunday the 6th, he makes the long drive into Roswell, and he doesn't go to the military base. He goes to the sheriff, George Wilcox. And Wilcox in turn contacts the base. It's important enough that the head intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel, takes the call. And it's important enough on a 4th of July weekend that he alerts the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard.
So how many days are we into this now? That's a 3-day period, 2-day period?
We're in the third day. And because he was the foreman on the ranch, he did not have hired hands. He didn't have help. So it was still his job to finish all the work on the ranch up till Saturday. And then it was on Sunday, his day off, that's when he came into Roswell. And that's where his nightmare began.
So no military yet.
Nobody is looking for anything, Brian. And you make a good point. Nothing has been reported missing. This is high desert. I have flown over this area in small planes, in helicopters. And one thing becomes quite evident, that once you are airborne, you can see for 50 miles.
Right.
So total, just no excursion whatsoever. The point being that if they were missing anything, they would have found it before the rancher did.
Right.
And so then whose was it? That's the whole point. And here, down in Roswell, the very base commander, Colonel Blanchard, upon examining some of the wreckage that Brazel brought into town, he dispatches Major Marcel, his head intelligence officer, and Captain Sheridan Cavett, a counterintelligence officer, in the event it's something foreign, also indicating that they have no idea what this wreckage is.
Got it.
So they follow Brazel back to the ranch. It's late evening by the time they arrive. They spend the night in a one-room shack called the Hines House, and the very next morning of Monday, July 7th, they start gathering up all the wreckage. They fill up 2 vehicles.
So July 7th is the first time the military enters the scene. July 2nd
Correct.
is the night of the actual incident.
Precisely. So it's been that many days, and the military has first learned of this crash 3 days later, and they first arrive at the scene 4 days later, first thing Monday, July 7th.
And who's first at the scene for the military?
First, the intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel,
Okay.
and the head of counterintelligence, Captain Sheridan Cavett. 2 high-ranking officers. Typically, you would send out a couple of enlisted men, check it out, report back to me. But the fact that he sends out his 2 lead intelligence officers also suggested that they were truly concerned as to the nature of this crash.
And might have had prior knowledge on what it was, who it was, and maybe.
Well, in all actuality, they behaved as though they had no idea. There was, as Colonel Blanchard would say later, at first they thought the wreckage had to be Soviet, Russian, because they had never seen anything like it before. But then as soon as they started to find other things, such as the bodies, they realized they weren't dealing with anything.
Well, hold on. So once Jesse Marcel and the counterintelligence officer arrived first, they
Right.
first saw the wreck site. They didn't
Correct.
see bodies, or did they see bodies?
Right. Brazel would have taken them over to another site about 2.5 miles from the debris field,
Right.
atop a bluff, where he and a number of young children had discovered 2 bodies that had either been ejected or were thrown from the craft as it exploded. Marcel would describe that by the pattern of the wreckage and the fact that it covered such a long distance, it was clearly a mid-air explosion, whether it was struck by lightning or an internal malfunction. It had exploded at some altitude. This was not a crash impact. Something caused it to break up. And then bodies were discovered a couple miles from that explosion. And then a final impact site about 25 miles from there, much closer to Roswell, where there was a pod, a capsule, egg-shaped, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And that's where they discovered 2 additional bodies and a survivor.
So we
So
have
3
one,
sites.
we have one ship, We have
Right.
one ship that imploded or exploded by itself, no collision.
No collision, and from all indications, it was a one object event, that it was the outer hull, that it was the cabin, the pod, like almost like an ejection seat, an ejection pod
Right.
that was propelled beyond the explosion, and that it was the outer shell, the outer hull of the ship
Okay.
that created all that debris, that extensive amount of debris.
And then when does the military come in to clean up? At what time period are we at after Jesse Marcel discovers the crash site, discovers the pod? Then is it an immediate call and they are there that night to dispose?
No, in fact, they spend the better part of the day at the crash site, at the debris field. They would
Okay.
fill up a Jeep carry-all with a box, like a pickup truck,
Mhm.
and Marcel was driving a 1942 Buick convertible. So he filled up the trunk, the back seat, the passenger side, and then he sent Cavett on ahead. So he had plans. He wasn't going to go directly to the base like Cavett.
Mhm.
He lived 10 miles north of the base. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, he stops at home. He wakes his wife, he wakes his son, Jesse Jr., and takes them out to the kitchen. And there he has all this debris scattered on the floor and on the kitchen table.
So wait a
And
minute,
that's when-
he's bringing the parts of the UFO home to show his kids.
Right. Right.
And
Because
they
he
can't
knew,
believe it.
exactly. And because he knew that crossed onto the base, all the material would be classified top secret. He would never have that chance again to show his family what he had in his possession. And it was that important to him. His son, their only son, Jesse knew about the atomic bomb
Mhm.
before the ending of World War II, the dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay.
He did a sketch for Jesse Jr., a fat man, the atomic bomb, and told him it was going to end the war, and then warned him he couldn't tell anybody because it would get his dad in a lot of trouble. And then he crumbled up the drawing. So he was that close to his son that he even conveyed secrets to him. Wonderful relationship.
So after he shows him this stuff, he shows him the memory metal, he shows him the stuff with the symbols on it, he shows him
Exactly.
you can't cut it, you can't burn it, and,
Right.
and
Right.
all foreign to the human eye. Then what happens to the rest of the material? He turns it in.
Right.
And when
And that he,
so the military must have come in at some point to remove the ship and remove the
Yes.
bodies.
yes, yes. And I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because it was while Marcel and Cavett are at the debris field. Other civilians, ranchers, and even a archaeological team alerted the military to the crash site much closer to Roswell, where the pod, 2 additional bodies, and the survivor were located. In fact, the sheriff and the fire department in Roswell also learned about this site immediately within their jurisdiction. The sheriff went out there, his deputies went out there, 2 firemen drove out in their own vehicle when they heard about the crash of the flying saucer north of town. And they were out there just as the military arrived on the scene.
And what timeline is that? What how many days into it is that?
While that is on Monday, July 7th, while Cavett and Marcel are gathering up the wreckage at the debris field, the military is already arriving at the crash site, the impact site, just north of town.
And
So-
let's talk about how the military took over. Let's talk about how they got rid of the fire department, the police department,
Right.
how they threatened people, how they put their stamp on the site. What can you tell us about that?
From all eyewitness testimony, they cordoned off the site just north of town on Monday, July 7th. They cordoned off all the outlying roads. You couldn't come into Roswell. You couldn't leave Roswell. They essentially were shutting off the city. Then they were going house to house with, as far as like the firemen. His name was Dan Dwyer. Military officers came to his home that evening. He was still at the firehouse, but they took his wife aside. They took his two daughters aside, and the daughter, Frankie, had held some of the memory material that a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins, that was given to him by Mac Brazo.
Wow.
He brought it into Roswell and he stopped at the firehouse. Well, she had stopped by just to say hello to her father. Well, he wasn't there. He was out at the crash site, checking out the rumors of the flying saucer crash. Okay. So it's all overlapping. But anyway, the military officers, they threatened the two young girls, specifically Frankie Rowe. They told her she would never see her parents again if she ever spoke another word about this. The police, the Sheriff Wilcox, he was quickly enlisted to serve as a proxy for all the civilians. In other words, because he's the sheriff, they used him to instill the fear of God into other civilians. And he also
Wait a minute, hold on. They took the sheriff at the time and they made him a what?
They made him pretty much the hit man.
Okay.
That he went to the civilians and reinforced the threats that they would be arrested, that they too would be in a lot of trouble with the government. And as the sheriff, he would be the one who could enforce. See, the military has no authority over civilians. Right. Obviously, the sheriff would. So they used him in that capacity, only later to then threaten him. They would threaten him and his family that if he ever talked about this, they would meet that same fate, that they too would be killed.
Now, was anyone reported missing? Were there people threatened to the point of death? Were they murdered? How far has it gone to keep this covered up? Because I have a big theory that there have been a lot of murders based on just this one event. And I think it started right off the bat. And not to mention the head of Majestic 12 being killed. But what can you tell us about possible things like that relate to actual murders and death even over this?
Right. We had a full bird colonel, an officer who was stationed at the base at that time. Uh-huh. And when we first talked to him, he was a reluctant witness. He wouldn't even admit he was there until we showed him his picture in the base yearbook from 1947. And they still would like to help you. I'll give you a quick example, Brian. Colonel Edwin Easley was the provost marshal, and he was in charge of all military security on the base. Okay. And just imagine when we found him in 1990, 43 years after the incident, and he's still stating over and over again, I'm still sworn to secrecy about that. I still cannot tell you anything about what happened back in Roswell in 1947. So we sent him a copy of our first book, and we called him later and said, Colonel, can you at least tell us if we're going in the right direction? To which he responded, let's just say you're not going in the wrong direction. Okay. So that's how the military answers you without admitting anything. So getting back to this colonel, he actually made the comment to us. He suggested, after not telling us anything, he said, if I were you investigating this incident, I would check back to all the accidents back at that time, all the car accidents, disappearances, and see if you could trace them to the incident. And one of the things we came up with, there was a lieutenant colonel on the base And we've yet to look into it. But because believe me, Brian, we have a gray basket that's going to take us years to finish. But
Right.
the information was that there was a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, who couldn't keep his mouth shut. He talked too much, and they couldn't keep him quiet. Well, his 6-year-old son, the story is, was playing out in the front yard, and there was a drive-by, and he was shot. His little son was killed.
That's horrible.
If that really did happen, you're talking about at a time when there were no drive-by shootings anywhere.
No.
Short of, Chicago in the 20s, where you had the mafia and organized crime, and, they were killing one another.
Right.
But they kill a child as though to send a message. So if we ever confirm that one, we're going to truly cry foul. Right. Because unless the police can demonstrate to us there was any cause, that it was a stray bullet, a ricochet, anything suggesting that somebody was accidentally caught, in crossfire. But aside from that, the information we have is that it was somebody who could not keep their mouth shut about the crash.
Well, I mean, if they're willing to go to that extent, now we know that, and that's just the beginning of it. Who knows, to this point, how that list is just increased dramatically. Well, what about the actual? I got to ask you before we run out of time. What about the actual bodies and the actual ship? Where were the bodies taken? Where was the ship taken after all this?
Brian, I can name you the drivers of the trucks, the flatbed lowboy, the ambulance trucks, the men who were on their hands and knees, shoulder to shoulder, gathering up every last shard of wreckage. And it all was brought back to the base at Roswell. It was kept at building P3, which was a B-29 hangar. Mm-hmm. Bodies were taken over to the base hospital just down the road from there. But from there on, there were special flights that departed the base, flights that came in, and trucks that transported out wreckage, freight cars on trains that also transported wreckage. And generally, it all went to foreign technology at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. This is a predecessor to Area 51. People always try to link 51 with Roswell, but 51 was not even created until 8 years later. So the Area 51 of 1947 was Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. That's where they did all the reverse engineering, all the testing of all captured German, Japanese, Russian technology. So in this case, it was of a truly foreign technology, but nonetheless, it still went to Wright Field. And what's interesting, Brian, is we tracked down many new witnesses who were stationed there, not Roswell, but Wright Field, who were on the receiving end. They were there when the wreckage and the bodies came in from Roswell.
That's just amazing. I mean, and then after that, what are the things that Roswell triggered in our government that changed from that point on? Because I know I wasn't the CIA started because of Roswell. Was there the National Security Act? What was it? What were we talking about before?
Well, yes, the fact that President Harry Truman would sign the National Security Act within days after Roswell, and that the CIA would then be established within a month after Roswell, which would handle foreign, whereas the National Security Act, for the first time, enabled the FBI and all branches of the military as far as in watching, monitoring, and then questioning American citizens in any event that they could be held responsible for. And in this case, it was anyone who possessed material from the crash or possessed information and was speaking out of turn. For the first time, it provided the military with authority over civilians.
And to this day, they exercise that, don't they?
Yes, they do. What is especially interesting, one last thing, Brian, is that 2 months after Roswell, then General Nathan Twining Sr. signed off on a letter which was prepared by engineers, propulsion, propeller, nuts and bolts engineers, truly suggesting that they had something in their possession. It was beyond just the sighting reports. It was just beyond a few fuzzy photographs. He went to his top hardware officers. And in the letter, it states emphatically, the phenomenon is real and not visionary or fictitious. Flying saucers exist. That was just 2 months after Roswell. And what's interesting is we've come full circle. Here we are, 75 years later, and we're acting like this is a new story. This is, late breaking information. We've come full circle.
Right. But it's a story that has to be looked back on because it's just the start of everything. And people at the same time, they can't forget about, they got to know where this all began. I just think that it's amazing that still to this day, we are at the same point we were in 1947. It's been 120, some odd year, or 100, whatever the math is, 80 years to this point since then.
Well, it'll be next year will be the 75th anniversary of Roswell.
75.
And as we now anticipate the Navy task force report and then the congressional report on UAPs, they're only going to go back to 2004. They're going to try to create the impression to the public, to the world, that there were no UFO incidents, no sightings, no reports, nothing before 2004. And in doing that, they can create the impression that this is much more contemporary, much more likely that it's hardware of a foreign design, or maybe even ours that we're not aware of. But the point being, what type of threat was this back in 1947? It certainly wasn't Russian. It wasn't Chinese. China was a third world country back in 1947. Russia didn't even have the atomic bomb till 5 years after we did, 4 years actually. So it's interesting how they're going to deny history again to create an impression that I'm afraid most people are going to walk away with and go, phew, we're not being invaded.
Now, just so people know, when you say UAPs, you mean unidentified aerial phenomenon?
Aerial phenomena, as the Navy now has created their own as far as terminology, whereas UFO was created by the Air Force.
Right.
And isn't it ironic right now that the principal investigator, the branch of the military, the Air Force, since 1947, on top of the UFO, they are strangely quiet in all this. They're not saying a word because they realize that no matter what they would say, most people would never believe them because they've been deceiving the public for almost 75 years.
Don, do you think we've reverse engineered this technology, or do you think we're still trying to figure it out and whatever we see is UFO?
I think they've had a few minor breakthroughs, such as with fiber optics and potentially as far as with microchips and some of the computer technology. But overall, I feel that we're still unable to bridge that technology gap. That when it comes to the memory material, when it comes to this nearly indestructible paper-thin metal, like as far as alloys that the ship was constructed of, that we were barely making a dent, excuse the pun. But if you can't figure something out, if you can't control the information, you cover it up. You pretend it didn't happen. Because as far as the government goes, it's all about control. For them to acknowledge that there are aircraft, unknowns, that are able to fly through our airspace with total impunity would be a tremendous shock for most people. and that the government is not in control of the air. And yet that's exactly what they'd have to acknowledge.
Well, the one thing they defend themselves with is national security, and that's the one thing they're not providing. They're just allowing us to be victims and left in the dark in all this, and assume that we're not going to put things together that are right in front of us over and over again.
And then what they do is to prevent us lay people from talking seriously about the subject, we're labeled conspiracy kooks, nuts. We're discredited. We're character assassinated. And you can trace that all the way back to Roswell. The very officer, General Roger Ramey, who had the weather balloon press conference, where they switched the balloon, they substituted it for the actual material. Then they allowed the press to take pictures. And a few days later, he was on an El Paso radio station. He was asked, well, General, that explains Roswell. What about all the other flying saucer reports? Isn't it true they're being cited in every corner of the country? To which he responded, that's true, except for Kansas, which is a dry state. So it's for the first time, it's implied that the only people who see such things over imbibe. They're drinkers.
Right. That's ridiculous. Well,
and we've all been conditioned, we've all been programmed to have that knee-jerk response. Somebody says they saw something, and we're always kind of, what were you drinking? Or what were you smoking? Where were you?
Right.
We've had it drilled into us for a lifetime.
It's true. Well, Don, thank you so much for being here on the Roswell special. I mean, there's so much more to talk about with Roswell, so I'm probably going to have to track you down again to run this back, maybe do a part 2
and hopefully in Roswell. So I offer you my personal invitation.
I'm there. I'm so there.
The red carpet treatment, and I'll make sure you see all the relevant sites. And you got it, Bryan.
We'll make sure we record all that for this series. So I'll see you soon.
Absolutely.
Don Schmitt, thank you for everything. You've been amazing. Thanks for joining us on Conspiracies Inc. And the only true definition of conspiracy is a group of people with a secret plan to do something unlawful or harmful. And that's the U.S. government doing what they do to us. That's kind of the definition of it. So
they're the masters.
Yeah.
They wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Don. I'll talk to you later. Thanks for joining us. You've been amazing. And we'll see you soon again.
Thank you, Bryan.
You're the best.
Thanks. My pleasure.
All right. Take care. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. And all of our social media accounts are on Linktree. If there's anyone you'd like us to book or any questions you'd like answered, go to our website at conspiraciesinc.podcast.com.